All right, folks, we are up to topic 4.9 of the APUSH curriculum. The development of an American culture is the title. And so we're going to take a break from talking about technology and all those other, the American system and all that stuff. And we're going to focus a little bit more on culture. We're going to look at some things called utopias. We're going to talk briefly about a few people who made impact on American culture in the early 1800s. So let's jump into the topic. Our guiding question is, how and why did a new national culture develop from 1800 to 1848? And let's get a little bit of context first before we delve too much into the details. What's going on in America is what's kind of going on in Europe as well. Remember, America in many ways is an extension of Europe, especially at this time period we were. And in the early 1800s over in Europe, writers and artists had embraced this new thing called Romanticism. So Romanticism is in some ways a reaction to the logic and reason and order that the Enlightenment had preached. So with the Enlightenment, everything's very logical. There's obviously sort of a almost like a scientific order to the universe. And that philosophy is kind of out. And what comes in with Romanticism is this idea that feelings and heroism and nature and emotion and intuition are far more important. So it's kind of a rejection of the Enlightenment and doing something a little bit more kind of focused on the not government, but instead like how people actually feel and act. This brings us into a philosophy that is born here in America called transcendentalism. Transcendentalism. So this is something that begins in the 1830s up in New England. And the term transcendentalism comes from this idea that truth is not something that you can simply observe like in a scientific fashion. Rather, truth is something that transcends the senses. So you can't just see truth, you can't just hear truth. Truth is something that goes beyond those. Instead, where you're going to find truth is with your inner light that illuminates the truth and puts yourself in contact with God. So this is a very, deep philosophy. There's a lot of religious elements mixed into this. It's definitely the Enlightenment figures would have just been aghast at this, like, oh my gosh, what are you talking about? That's truth is something that's finite, whereas in transcendentalism, truth is something that's a little more flexible and kind of up to each individual. So let's look at some characteristics. If you are a transcendentalist, you probably believe in one or all of these things. You believe in the power of the individual. You believe individuals should be self-reliant and self-disciplined. You believe that people should be working very hard, and they should also love nature, and they should show respect for all people. So those are some key beliefs of transcendentalism. Now, when you're talking about the transcendentalists, there are several we could mention, but we're going to focus on just one today. His name is Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's a pretty famous American thinker and writer. He wrote extensively and spoke extensively on the ideas of things like self-improvement and being an independent thinker, being optimistic about the future, embracing freedom. And he also criticized slavery because slavery doesn't fit into the mold of any of those things I just mentioned, right? Slavery is the opposite of freedom. There's nothing optimistic about slavery. There's no self-improvement in slavery. Slavery is a system that will just continue in perpetuity with no hope for a better life. And that is definitely not what transcendentalism is all about. Transcendentalism is all about improving yourself and getting better as every day goes on. The quote here from Emerson I think is pretty illuminating. He says, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." So to be yourself, right? Being independent is a transcendentalist belief. All right, another transcendentalist we're going to talk about, also from New England, is Henry David Thoreau. And Thoreau was a philosopher and thinker and writer He's also what we call a nonconformist. In other words, someone who sees rules as limiting, and sometimes rules have to be broken, and it's okay to do that if you believe you're doing the right thing. He helps popularize a philosophy known as civil disobedience. And civil disobedience simply means is if you believe that there's a law that is immoral and unjust, to follow that rule, follow that law, is immoral. That the moral thing to do is to actually break that law. Now, he's not advocating a violent revolution. He's simply saying if the law says do this and that law is wrong, it's immoral, then don't do that. Publicly break the law and accept the consequences to show people how wrong the law is. Famously, he refused to pay his taxes to support the Mexican War, which he believed was a war meant to spread slavery, and he was obviously very much opposed to slavery, so he felt it was his duty to not pay taxes and accept the consequences, and he did, in fact, spend a very, very, very short amount of time in jail for not paying his taxes. Now, this idea of kind of pushing back against the system and not accepting the immoral institutions in front of you is something that's very inspiring. It will, of course, inspire Gandhi in his efforts to achieve independence for India in the 1930s and 40s. It will inspire Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in America with the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. And so this guy really left a pretty big mark on the world. Now, one more book I thought I would share with you because it really fits into this whole idea of transcendentalism being sort of transfixed on independence and self-reliance in nature. And it's called Walden, or Life in the Woods. So basically what he did is he spent 2 years as kind of an experiment of sorts out in a hut, in a small cabin. You can see a replica of the cabin right here, near this thing called Walden Pond, which is outside of Boston. So it's out in a rural area, and there he lived a very simple life. He wrote about his experiences. In his experiences, he criticizes materialism and capitalism. Not that they would have used the term capitalism necessarily right there, but he was basically criticizing what it was, this profit motive and all that. He criticized the effect of technology on the environment and on people itself, and he was really taken aback about how simple life can actually be. That the necessities humans need to survive are actually very small, and that we spend our whole life chasing things that are not necessities, that are extras, that sometimes push us to be stressed and sometimes push us to do terrible things when they're not even really necessary. All right, now we're going to shift gears a little bit, but this is still definitely related to transcendentalism. It's utopia time. So what we're going to see is that the Romantic movement preached a message that humans are perfectible. In other words, humanity is always striving to get better and better and better, and eventually we can reach this sort of like perfect existence where everyone is equal and living in peace. Now, we look at this today and we think, that is idiotic, right? That's not possible. That is just, it goes against human nature. But people from this time who bought into this really believe that human nature is something that can be shaped and changed. And so what they're going to do is they're going to try to actually jumpstart this by setting up new communities across America. And we're going to begin with one from a guy named Robert Owen, who came from Britain. He had opened a factory in Britain called New Lanark up in Scotland, and had been kind of this model factory where workers were treated well, and it was a better model of what factories could be. And so he decides to bring this philosophy over to America, specifically to Indiana, and establish a new community he called New Harmony. And New Harmony ultimately was going to be this utopian socialist community where everyone was going to share everything equally. Everyone is going to work hard and contribute to the greater good, and the community would be kind of the all-important thing that everyone would dedicate themselves to. So this obviously is not going to work. And this New Harmony thing never really gets off the ground very well. This image you see here, none of this was actually built. This was all kind of like the plan of what it was going to look like, assuming New Harmony had succeeded, which it definitely did not. All right, a more successful example of this utopian society thing was called Oneida Community. This was established in 1848 in the state of New York, and the goal, like New Harmony, was to create this basically total equality-based society where everyone shared everything, everyone worked together. In fact, they were sharing not just wealth, but each other. Oneida got a lot of attention because it practiced what's known as what they called complex marriages. What people also referred to at this time period as free love. And what that simply means is rather than marrying someone and being sort of locked in to that spouse for your life, you would basically kind of just exchange people. You would share everyone, and you would have this just society where everyone is engaged with everyone else. Which means, of course, when it comes time for children to be raised, like who knows who the children are? So they decided they would communally raise children. You wouldn't even really necessarily know whose kids they were. They would all just be kind of well, I shouldn't say property, but certainly like they would be the responsibility of the entire community. Now, if you're wondering why I have silverware here, the reason is the Oneida community made its money through making silverware, and Oneida is still a brand of silverware today. Now, they're not in New York practicing free love. It's a corporation today, but that is where it started, and believe it or not, again, that company is still around, which makes me never want to buy Oneida silverware. All right, our next group are called the Shakers. They get their name, the Shakers, because they were also called shaking Quakers. These were very devout religious people, and when they got together, had their meetings and prayers, they would sing and dance, and some of them would shake and sort of jerk around in sort of religious spasms, and that's where the shaking came from. Now, this was never a gigantic group, and it wasn't one group anyways. They were kind of scattered branches across the country. Ultimately, at their peak, they reached about 6,000 members. Now, they believed in separation of gender. So men and women would work separately. They did not, marry. There was no sex going on. At least that was the story. They're not supposed to be doing that kind of stuff. Men and women would, meet communally to have meals and prayers and stuff like that. But in general, they kind of lived separate lives. But like any good utopia, they believed in sharing property in common. And this shaking Quaker or Shakers thing went on all the way into the 20th century. What ultimately dooms the Shakers, of course, is the fact that they don't have kids. And so the only new recruits they can get are through adoptions. And that kind of dries up, and eventually the Shakers fizzle out. Now, if you're wondering why I have a picture of a dresser over here, is the Shakers were also very famous for their furniture. They were considered very good craftsmen, and Shaker furniture was in high demand. All right, very quickly, guys, let's talk about the arts. So there's one art movement we're going to point to from this time period called the Hudson River School. The Hudson River, of course, is in upstate New York. And if you've ever seen the Hudson River, it flows through just an absolutely beautiful area of hills and mountains and forests. And it's just really picturesque. And so that's what we're going to see with the Hudson River School, is lots and lots of landscapes. And this ties in also to that nationalism we saw peaking after the War of 1812, because we're proud of who we are. We look at our country and we see just untamed wilderness and natural beauty, and we're proud of that. We want to kind of show it off and share that with the people. And so when you look at these paintings, you see that. There's the untamed nature, the raw beauty of America. Thomas Cole, that's the name you see on several of these paintings, probably the most famous of these Hudson River School artists. Here's one called Niagara Falls. All right, there's one author we're going to look at today. It's an author that most of us have heard of, at least in passing, probably not read much of them. He's kind of really the first American to win fame overseas. Most American authors wrote for an American audience, and that's about as far as it went. Europeans often looked down on American literature as being sort of primitive and almost childish. But this guy, Washington Irving, really kind of breaks that mold. And in 1819 through 1820, he publishes this thing called the Sketchbook. And in this sketchbook, he has stories he's written, two of which, of course, are still super famous, like Rip Van Winkle, the guy who falls asleep, and then, of course, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is very appropriate for October, right? When you think of Halloween, you think of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow and the Headless Horseman. All right, guys, that was a quick look at American culture being changed in the first half of the 1800s. We talked about Romanticism. We looked at transcendentalism, the Hudson River School, civil disobedience, utopias. We were all over the place, guys, but there's a lot of stuff changing in America in this time period.